Alright, welcome back. Sebastian here. So today I want to talk about Carlos Sainz's 2025 F1 season. First season at Williams has definitely not gotten off to the, I'm not going to say start because the season's more than halfway finished, but at least through basically 2/3 of the season, it's been pretty rough so far. And today I want to do kind of a race by race look at each of the races we've had so far and talk about what's kind of gone wrong for Sainz in 2025. So first, of course, Australia. So qualifying qualifies P10, ill-qualified by his teammate Alex Albon by about 0.3 of a second, who qualifies in P6. Then in the Grand Prix, crashes towards the beginning of the race in the wet conditions. Definitely a bit of an oopsie there. Meanwhile, his teammate Albon, very strong Grand Prix, ends up finishing P5. And at the bottom, I've also included where I put both drivers in my power rankings for that respective Grand Prix weekend. So for Australia, Sainz was in 18th and Albon was in 5th. And yeah, like I said, the big I would say highlight, at least in the negative, for Sainz for that weekend is of course that crash, a bit of a clumsy crash, basically right after, I think right on the safety car restart from Jack Doohan's crash, which was brought out that first safety car. So that was the first week in Australia. Definitely not a great start there. Moving on to round 2, and we get to the sprint in China. Sainz qualifies P13, out-qualified by his teammate Albon, who qualified P9 by about 7.8 of a second. So a really big gap there in sprint qualifying. And then in the sprint finishes P17, 12.1 seconds behind his teammate Albon, who finished in P11. The other thing I wanted to mention for the sprint is that Sainz was, I think, the only driver to pit during that sprint race, really struggling with tire management during that race, during that sprint, I should say, and so opted to sprint, which of course is responsible for that pretty big gap to his teammate Albon. And when we get to the main, Grand Prix portion of the weekend, things were not that much better. Qualifies P15, teammate Albon qualifies P10, out-qualified by Albon by about 2.5 of a second. Then in the Grand Prix, makes his way up to P10, but finishes 20 seconds behind his teammate Albon. And of course, this is a weekend where 3 drivers got disqualified. I believe Gasly, Hamilton, and Leclerc, of course. So that meant that for some of the midfield cars, they ended up getting quite a few more points than they finished on the road. So for example, for Sainz, he would have finished P12 on the road, and then of course was promoted to that P10 position. So again, a little bit of luck there in Albon's favor, because it means that the point spread from that race goes from a +2 for Albon to suddenly being a +5. In terms of the difference between how many points he would have scored thanks to those disqualifications. Now in the power rankings overall, Albon was 7th and Sainz was 16th. So 2 weekends pretty far down on the power rankings, so definitely not an ideal start for him. And meanwhile, his teammate Albon's picked up quite a few points. Now we get to round 3 in Japan. Things do get a little bit better in qualifying. Qualifies P12. Only half a tenth off his teammate Albon there, so again much closer in qualifying, and Albon qualifies P9. Now for the Grand Prix, of course, this was a race where there was almost 0 overtaking. Drivers basically finished where they started for the most part, and of course for Sainz, for his great luck, he picked up a 3-place grid penalty, I think, for impeding, and that meant that he started P15, so only moves his way up to P14. Finishes 33.8 seconds off his teammate Albon, who finishes in the points again in P9. In terms of my power rankings, Sainz was 15th and Albon was 4th. So it's 3 weekends in a row where Albon was in the top 10, and 3 weekends where Sainz was basically in the bottom 5 or 6 drivers. Definitely not an ideal start to life at Williams. Then we get to round 4, and for the first time, Sainz out-qualifies his teammate Albon. Out-qualifies him by about 4.5 of a second. Albon qualified P15. Technically, it was P16, but Hulkenberg, thanks to this race control and the stewards having a great time of it this weekend, Hulkenberg basically got into Q2, had his lap from Q1 deleted, but it was already after Q2, so Albon could not rejoin the session and basically didn't set a time. So yeah, not great luck on the stewards part there for sure, but this was finally a weekend where Sainz starts in the top 10 and Albon is pretty far behind him. Now, unfortunately for Sainz, he rewards his first top 10, following up on his first top 10 start of the year. He DNFs, and we'll get into that DNF in a bit. And for Albon, he makes up a little bit of positions, a couple positions from his starting position, and ends up P12. But that being said, still thought Sainz was a better driver through the weekend. He ends up 9th on my power rankings, and Albon ends up in P11. And now for the reason for that DNF, and of course this was the clash between Tsunoda and Sainz. Again, this was a racing incident. Neither driver was given a penalty for this, but it left Sainz with damage on his car. He was unable to continue and forced to retire in the pit lane. So again, that's definitely a big missed opportunity, points that he definitely could have gotten in this Bahrain Grand Prix. So after the first 4 races, Sainz is sitting in 16th in the Drivers' Championship with 1 point. And that was of course the Chinese Grand Prix where 3 drivers got disqualified. And Albon, meanwhile, is 8th in the championship with 18 points. So he's been a much better job of basically maximizing the results of the car. And at this point, the first 4 races of the season, Williams, I would say, was consistently the 5th or the 6th best car. I think Racing Bulls had a very, very fast car as well as some of these races, but they had a couple big strategic oopsies, especially during the first 2 Grand Prix. Now, moving into the 5th race of the season, this is Saudi Arabia. Again, Sainz out-qualifies his teammate. Qualifies P6, out-qualifies Albon by about a 1/10 of a second, who qualified in P11. Then in the Grand Prix, a pretty solid Grand Prix for Sainz. I would say one of his more all-round better Grand Prix this year. Race finishes P8, 1.8 seconds in front of his teammate Albon, who finishes P9. And as a reward for that, I put Sainz 3rd in my power rankings, but Albon, bit of a good comeback there, ends up P7 on my power rankings. So even though this is a weekend where Sainz finishes in the points, gets a good points haul, he only gains 2 points over his teammate Albon in terms of points tallied, because his teammate, of course, also finished in the points that weekend. Now, race 6, this was in Miami. This is one of, I would say, Williams' best weekends just in terms of pure pace. Now, in terms of the sprint, Sainz qualified P15, out-qualified by his teammate Albon by about 0.04 of a second. So again, very, very tight margin there, but Albon finishes qualifying in P8. And then in the sprint, Sainz doesn't finish the race, crashes out, and his teammate finishes P11. I believe Albon finished 5th on the road, but was given a 5-second penalty for a safety car infringement, so could have been more points there for Albon. Bit of a missed opportunity, but a bit of bad luck as well, given that there was a safety car very, very late in the race, very late in the sprint, and that meant that a bunch of drivers, including Albon's former teammate Verstappen, was also kind of given a pretty harsh penalty because of the nature of the way that the race ended. And of course, for Sainz, it was a bit of a wet, dry race in the sprint, and basically opted to pit for dry tires. Didn't go so well, had a bit of a spin, a bit of a crash, and that was, of course, another missed opportunity there. And then in the Grand Prix, qualifies P6, out-qualifies Albon again, out-qualifies his teammate by about a 1/10 of a second. But in the Grand Prix, Albon gets past Sainz at the start, thanks to Verstappen basically trying to take Norris out and some very aggressive blocking by the Dutch driver. And basically Albon then gets ahead of Sainz right from the get-go. In the Grand Prix, finishes P9, 12.5 seconds off his teammate, who finished in P5, and basically the two of them basically split the 2 Ferraris in a weekend which I think caused quite a bit of concern at Maranello. The fact that Williams were basically faster than them on pace. Albon had a great race. Sainz, I think, struggled a bit for race pace and ended up getting passed by both Ferraris as well in this Grand Prix. So for this one, it was really a big about the fact that Sainz, I think, really struggled for race pace. But that being said, wasn't a terrible weekend overall. Some pretty strong performances in qualifying as well. And so for power rankings, I did Albon 3rd and for Sainz 9th. So again, still top half. Just unfortunate that he gets only 2 points, whereas his teammate got 10 from this Grand Prix. All right, and even in this race, he did have a bit of an incident with Hamilton on the final lap with a bit of contact there. But luckily, nothing really came of it. Both drivers were able to finish the Grand Prix. Then we get to round 7, Emilia-Romagna, and this is one of the, I would say, 2 races where I think bad luck can be a really good argument used for why Sainz was unable to score I would say, big points during this Grand Prix. Another strong qualifying performance, qualifies P6, out-qualifies his teammate Albon by about 0.04 of a second. Again, his teammate qualifies P7, so pretty close behind him. Then in the Grand Prix, finishes P8, but his teammate finishes P5, and he ends up finishing basically 5 seconds off his teammate. But I did think that Sainz was the better of the two drivers over this weekend. So I put him second on my power rankings, where I put Albon in fourth. The reason for the bad luck was the timing of the BSC. Basically, Sainz, I believe there was one very early BSC. Sainz opts to pit, and a bunch of other drivers as well. Albon stays out. And then a bit later on, there's a full safety car. And of course, that gives you a bigger benefit when pitting than a VSC does. So Albon and a couple other drivers as well basically end up pitting during that second, I believe, full safety car period. And that means that he ends up basically ahead of his Spanish teammate, which again was a big factor in influencing the result of this race. So I think, again, this was a race where I felt like, bad luck can absolutely be used as a reason why Sainz was just not able to get the same points haul as his teammate. But again, that's something that was definitely, I would say, more often than not, it was not a massive factor. There's only, I would say, 2 races where bad luck was, I think, a big factor, and I think this was one of those 2. Now, we get to race 8, and that was Monaco. Now, for those of you who remember the Grand Prix was a bit of a farce. Teams were basically doing these crazy tactics during the pit stops, and basically it meant that you had drivers who basically ended up multiple laps down, and teams, including Williams, doing some pretty aggressive tactics to basically block cars behind to allow both their drivers to end up basically pitting with no penalty. So again, but as always, Monaco, a race where qualifying is really important. So for Sainz, qualified P11, 6/10 off his teammate Albon, who qualified in P10. And then in the Grand Prix, both drivers moved up 1 position, P9 for Sainz, P9 for Albon, because Alonso had terrible luck and his engine went kaboom. For Sainz, power rankings, I put him 13th, and for Albon, 11th. I felt neither of them really maximized the pace of the Williams, but that being said, neither of them had bad weekends either. All right, so after 8 races, about 1/3 of the way through the season, Sainz was now 12th in the championship with 12 points. He had moved up 4 positions from the 4 races previously, and he had gained 11 points. Albon, on the other hand, stayed in 8th place, but still, despite the fact that if I split basically the 16 races we've done now into 4 race blocks, this was Sainz's best block relative to Albon, but still he only scored half of his teammates' points, which I think is a pretty troubling trend. So for Albon, again, gained 22 points and stayed 8th in the Drivers' Championship. So now we move on to round 9, and this was Spain. For Spain, this was one of Williams' worst tracks, I would say, worst Grand Prix. Sainz, but really tricky qualifying session, ends up qualifying P18, out-qualified by his teammate by 1.6 of a second, and his teammate Albon qualified in P11. And then in the Grand Prix, a bit of a woeful Grand Prix, recovered to P14, but still not great overall. For Albon, he suffered a bit of a tough weekend, broke 2 front wings, once I think at the start and once clashing with Lawson, and again eventually ended up DNFing from the Grand Prix. But overall, I felt Albon was marginally better, had him 15th in my power rankings compared to 16th for Sainz. And this was a weekend where, even if you can say, maybe Sainz was a little bit better here, especially in the Grand Prix portion, this was a weekend that Williams was not great. And so unfortunately a weekend where Sainz is there to pick up points, where in this case Albon's DNF'd, the Williams was not performing at a level where Sainz could take advantage of that to kind of even up the result in terms of the points discrepancy. So now moving on to round 10, and this was Canada. So again, a bit of a tough qualifying session here for Sainz. Qualifies P17, out-qualified by his teammate Albon by 3/10, teammate qualifying P10. But in the Grand Prix, Sainz able to make up quite a few positions, ends up finishing the race in P10. Albon, unluckily for him, doesn't finish the race with a mechanical DNF. So in my power rankings, I had Sainz in 7th, and I had Albon in 15th again. Sainz moving up quite a bit due to his strong comeback in the Grand Prix. But again, this was a race where you could reasonably say that if Sainz had qualified P10, P11, P12, if he had that strong race pace, could easily ended up with a 7th place or an 8th place finish, and that was just not available today, or he was just not able to get to that point on this Grand Prix weekend. All right, now moving on to race 11 in Austria, and this was another race, I think like Emilia Romagna, where you can definitely look at luck and say that, you know, for Sainz, if he had better luck, could have had a much better result at the end of this Grand Prix. So again, another rough qualifying session. Qualifies P19, out-qualified by his teammate Albon by 0.4 of a second. His teammate qualifying P12. Then in the Grand Prix, doesn't start the race because of a mechanical failure, I believe brake issue. And that means that despite the fact that you're starting very low down, doesn't have the opportunity to even take the start potential to score points. The reason I say that this is bad luck is because the driver finished starting directly behind him, Nico Hülkenberg, was able to recover to, I believe, P7. So it definitely showed that even starting from this low, because of the nature of this, you know, Red Bull Ring circuit, overtaking is possible. You know, you can move your way up the field if you have really strong race pace. And unfortunately for Sainz, not able to show that on this occasion. So Albon as well, not much better luck either. He retired from the race with a mechanical issue. So for power ranking, P18 for Sainz, P13 for Albon. And then we get to race 12, and that was the British Grand Prix, a pretty chaotic race, as we all remember. Sainz out-qualifies Albon here, qualifies P11, out-qualifies his teammate by 1.5 of a second, his teammate down in P14. But again, if you remember this Grand Prix, it was a pretty chaotic race, wet, dry race, a lot of different strategies. It meant that qualifying results were a lot less relevant than Grand Prix like Japan or Belgium, which we'll be talking about in a little bit. And as a result, Sainz finishes P12, 12.5 seconds off his teammate Albon, who finishes in P8. And for my power rankings, I felt neither driver really, you know, got the most out of the car this weekend. And as a result, both drivers were in the bottom 10 of my power rankings, Sainz P18 and Albon in 13th. And again, I do think this was a pretty big missed opportunity for Sainz, just because when you look at, you know, the result, you know, Hülkenberg got a podium, Stroll got points, Gasly got points. There was a lot of points available for drivers in midfield teams. And so after 12 races, this was, you know, undoubtedly Williams' worst 4-race stretch of the season. Sainz has now dropped 2 positions in the Drivers' Championship. He's now down in 15th, and he's only gained a single point, now sitting on 13. Meanwhile, despite the fact that his teammate Albon only gained 4 points, he still gained 4 times more points than his Spanish teammate. And so now we move on to the most recent leg of 4 races. And so starting that out with not round 6, what are we on? Round 13, yes, round 13 in Belgium. For the sprint, honestly, a very, very good sprint for Sainz. Qualifies P6, out-qualifies his teammate Albon by about 0.4. And then because it's a sprint and often the positions don't really change that much, he finished the sprint in P6. Then for Albon, qualified, finished where he qualified and finished the sprint in P16. Then when we look at the Grand Prix, Sainz started P15, or he qualified P15, but I believe had to take, he opted to take a grid penalty, start with, you know, fresh engine components, that forced him to start from the pit lane, I believe. Albon, excellent qualifying session, qualifies P5, Sainz being out-qualified by 2.5 tenths, and this was, you know, qualifying that would really hurt, given that, you know, this was a race where, you know, Williams is obviously very, very strong, you know, Albon able to qualify in the top 6. Then in the Grand Prix, Albon finishes P6 from that P5 starting position, and Sainz, well, from the pit lane, he's only able to get to P18 in part because it's a race where overtaking was very difficult, and he ends up finishing 52 seconds off his teammate. Now, in terms of power rankings, Albon I put 2nd, Sainz I put in 15th. And this was definitely a weekend I would say would be a big missed opportunity. Better qualifying session would have meant, you know, likely a pretty good points haul in this Grand Prix. Now, moving on to round 14, a bit like Sainz in the fact that this was a weekend where Sainz was, a bit like Spain, I should say, in that this was a weekend where Sainz was definitely the better of the 2 drivers, but it was a weekend where Williams were simply not performing. So for Sainz, qualified P13, out-qualified his teammate Albon, who qualified P20 by almost 0.6 of a second. Then in the Grand Prix, actually loses a position, finishes P14, and for Albon, he makes his way up to P15, so they basically finish back-to-back on the road. And then from power rankings for Sainz, taking into account that this was a really weak Grand Prix for Williams, I ranked Sainz in 10th, I ranked Albon in 14th. Now, moving on to the two recent Grand Prix in the Netherlands, the Dutch Grand Prix, and then, of course, last time out in Italy. For Sainz, qualified P9 at the Dutch Grand Prix, out-qualified Albon, who qualified P15 by 1.8 tenths of a second. So good qualifying session there, but a bit of an incident in the Grand Prix, which we'll talk about in a moment. Ends up finishing P13, 11 seconds off his teammate who finished P5. Excellent start to get himself up to P10. And then, basically benefited from a bit of a good strategy, and then other cars basically, eliminating themselves from the Grand Prix. Power rankings, I put Sainz in 17th. I did think he had responsibility for the incident that we're about to talk about, or at least I should say some responsibility for the incident we're about to talk about. And then for Albon, I had him P6. Now, of course, the incident that I was mentioning was the one between Lawson and Sainz, where Sainz basically attempted to overtake Lawson around the outside of turn 1 on the safety car restart after Hamilton crashed. He basically was given a 10-second penalty for this, and of course, a couple days ago, penalty was actually rescinded. But of course, the time can't be removed from the race result because he served it during the race. So that's obviously a bit of I would say a weak spot of the way that the current, the regulations are written as they are. But still, I do think for this incident, while it was not 100% Sainz's responsibility, I do think he had to take some responsibility for that. And again, a bit of a race where, looking through this entire season, it's one of, I would say, at least 3 or 4 incidents that he's had this season where he's had wheel-to-wheel, contact with another car in the race. And he's kind of come off in, I would say, several of these cases, second best. Now, moving on to the most recent race we just had, that was the Italian Grand Prix. Qualifying, he qualifies Albon again here, but I think compared to expectations, since that this is this has been a Williams track for years now, going back to 2020, basically 2014, I would say. Sainz qualifies P13, like I said, and then again Albon P14. I think it's definitely a bit of a letdown, the qualifying result. Now for the Grand Prix, another incident here for Sainz, ends up finishing P11, 13.9 seconds off his teammate Albon, who had a great race, really strong race pace on the alternative strategy, starting on the hard, going on the medium, and he ended up finishing P7. And for power rankings, again, not great for Sainz, 16th, and for Albon, another pretty solid result in 9th. And again, this time the incident was with Behrman. I felt, again, even though Behrman got the penalty for this, similar to what we had last time, I felt it was a racing incident, and as a result, it means both drivers have to take some responsibility. And again, I think Sainz, for his part here, I think turned in on Behrman way too aggressively, and probably, again, should have taken a bit of responsibility for that incident. So we've gone over all 16 races that we've had so far, and so when you look at the standings after 16 races, Sainz has dropped a further 3 positions. He's only gained 3 points in the last 4 races, currently sitting on 16 points, and all 3 of those points were in the sprint in Belgium. So he's not scored any points in the Grand Prix over the last 4 races. Albon, meanwhile, has somehow gained a position in the Drivers' Championship. He's now 7th, 24-point gain, now sitting on 70 points ahead of the Mercedes of Kimi Antonelli. So when you look at kind of the stats for this, when you look at the qualifying stats, for example, I've put Albon on the left and Sainz on the right here, even though for this entire video it's been the other way around, so apologies for that. But qualifying, it's been very, very close between the two of them. In terms of simply Grand Prix qualifying, the qualifying head-to-head is 8-8, so it's basically tied with the median qualifying gap in Albon's favor, but by an extremely small margin of 6 thousandths of a second. So again, generally shows that qualifying has not been an issue for Sainz. He's generally been very, very evenly matched with his tied teammate. And so when you look at the points discrepancy, sometimes if qualifying can explain a lot of the points discrepancy between a set of teammates, that's definitely not the case here. Average starting position, slightly better for Albon, 10.81 compared to Sainz's 11.67. And some of that can be explained by some of the grid penalties that Sainz has taken. For example, pit lane start or the 3-point grid penalty he had to take in Japan. Now, when you look at the races, this is where things are a bit of a big problem for Sainz. So the race head-to-head where both drivers finished the Grand Prix is 9-2. And that's going to be, that's a pretty lopsided tally there. when you look at my expected points model and look at points above expected, interestingly enough, right now, both drivers are expected to score very, very similar amounts of points. I think it's about 37. Both drivers have basically been expected to score. And so when you look at points above expected, Albon sitting on a positive 32.9, so almost 200%. And for Sainz, he's sitting on a negative 24.3, so it means he scored 24 points less than he would be expected, like an average driver would be expected to score, based on the starting position, based on the strength of the car, and also based on some luck as well. Luck in this case being, if it's a really crazy race, if there's big points available, drivers, of course, are going to be, especially midfield and lower, are going to be expected to score more points than if it's a really boring race and, your front runners all finish, in positions, 1 through 6 or 1 through 8 or whatever. Now, in terms of average finishing position, again, you can kind of see the big discrepancy here. 7.85 for Albon, 11.62 for Sainz. And again, I don't think you can just, throw this away as just bad luck on Sainz's part as well. When you look at my power rankings, which again I try to do as objectively as possible, taking into account things like luck, Albon sitting on an 8.4, where Sainz has on average been basically ranked 4 positions lower, at 12.1. Now, when you look, I would say, like, just as a kind of concluding kind of rationale, I want to look at one more thing before I finish, but as a kind of a concluding rationale, I think there's a couple big factors that explain why Sainz has had such a big points gap to his teammate Albon, and kind of why he's gone wrong, what's gone wrong for him so far this year. I think the first one is that his race pace has not been as strong as Albon. There's been races that have been relatively incident-free, where his tire management has not been quite as good as his teammate. So, for example, Miami I think would be a good example of this, and then I would also put the sprint in China would be another example of this. Even though neither Sainz or Albon scored points there, but it's a good example of a situation where Sainz was the only driver to pit because his tires were going off, and this was again very, very early in the seasons where you had some very inexperienced drivers as well. So again, it does stand out quite a bit there. I do think he's been not necessarily clumsy, but he's had quite a few incidents this year, and quite a few of those instances have cost him big points. Australia comes to mind, Bahrain, the Dutch Grand Prix, for example. That's 3 races right there where you have big incidents. And then I do think there's been a little bit of bad luck. He's had weekends where he's been better than Albon, but those weekends have also coincided with the Williams car not being very good. So, for example, Spain and Hungary, and then of course you have the kind of races where he's had pretty bad luck. So, for example, Emilia-Romagna, and then the Austrian race where he didn't start as well. And on the other hand, I feel like Albon has kind of not necessarily overachieved, but he's done a very good job of being opportunistic, maximizing his points totals in the weekends where Williams have been good, where they've had a very competitive car that's been at times 4th or 5th best. And so I think that's really been the big difference between the two of them. And I think one other thing as well is I think Williams stopped development on the 2025 car very early. And that means that generally the cars, relative to the rest of the midfield, their performance has gone down a little bit. They've had races where they've been, like Hungary, where they were like arguably one of the slowest teams there. And that trend is likely going to continue. Sorry about that. Likely going to continue, towards the end of the season, as some other teams will kind of bring their final upgrade packages for the season. And so that means that I think the points total will be a little bit skewed in ways that sometimes when you have an experienced driver with a rookie, like for example Bottas in Zhou's 2022 season, where Bottas scored the bulk of his points at the very beginning of the season, where the Alfa Romeo at that time was very, very strong. Zhou, of course, was still kind of getting his feet wet, learning the ropes, and so by the time that you got to the second half of the season, where Zhou was much closer than Bottas, the car was much worse than it had been at the start of the season, and that meant that even if Zhou had weekends where he was better than Bottas, he was not able to turn that performance into points. And so it kind of really skewed the points tally for Bottas and Zhou that season. And so you might be having a little bit of that as well, where of course Sainz coming to a new team takes some time to get embedded. And so, for example, like the first quarter of the season, which was probably Albon's strongest, did a really good job there, but you know, that was where Sainz had his biggest, was kind of still learning a lot about how to race at Williams. So again, next 8 races I think will be really key. If Sainz continues to struggle, if he continues to not be the best Williams driver in the races, I think qualifying, again, not a big problem, but in the race performance, I think at least over one of these next 4 race blocks, he does have to start being the better, you know, Williams driver, not get into these incidents like he's had the last 2 races in particular. But otherwise, I think it could be very, I think there'll be big questions in 2026. I think there'll be quite a bit of pressure on Sainz if he's not able to turn his form around next year. And again, this is a driver who, you know, last year was a race winner at Ferrari, but unfortunately, you know, things in F1 can change very, very quickly. And as they say, you're only as good as your last race. So again, if Sainz's form does not turn around, he could be, you know, at risk of losing his seat in Formula One. Not next year, of course, but I would say after 2026. And again, it depends on what his contract with Williams is like as well. But again, I think based on his reputation, I do think he will have a little bit more of a grace period than, you know, maybe a lesser performing driver would. The one last thing I want to talk about in this video, I know this video is already 31 minutes long, but last thing I want to talk about is to just do a race by race breakdown of Sainz's points above expected in 2025. Just so that we can, you know, pretty clearly see, you know, which races, which weekends have been the ones that have cost Sainz the most in terms of points. So when you look at the red bar, this is basically the red bars. These are basically how many points Sainz has lost on each weekend compared to what is expected. I think even though he scored 16 points, 13, I believe, in Grand Prix, it shows that he hasn't had a single weekend in the positive where he's actually scored more than expected. So that's kind of part of the reason why I said that, you know, I think the race pace has been a bit of an issue. But you can see the ones where there's the biggest red bars. You have race 1, that's Australia. Race 4, Bahrain. Incident with Sonoda. Race 1, of course, crashed out. Race 6, that was Miami. So again, that was just kind of poor race pace there. Race 12, British Grand Prix, a bit of a chaotic race there. A lot of drivers had some pretty negative bars for that race. And a couple others, obviously, very positive, since they scored a lot more than they were expected to. And then, of course, race 15, that was Dutch Grand Prix with the incident with Lawson. So basically right there was 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. There was 5 races, you know, contribute a big way to having Sainz, you know, having a negative 24 for his points above expected. So there you go. That's my analysis of Sainz's 2025 season, what's gone wrong for him so far. I think it's been a combination of a lot of different things, but I do think his problems are, you know, really restricted to the race. And the fact that he hasn't really been able to have, you know, he hasn't been able to have very many clean Grand Prix where he's basically had a good qualifying and a good race. He's had races where he's had, you know, weekends where he's really, really good qualifying and then a bad race, or weekends where he's had bad qualifying and then a really, really good race. And I think, unfortunately, in F1 in 2025, where the margins between the cars are so small, you really need to have good qualifying and a good race in the midfield in order to score points. So we'll see what happens over the last 8 races of the season. But that's all for this video. Thank you so much for watching. If you're still watching 33 minutes into this, and I'll see you in the next video. Goodbye.